Leroy Williams walked into the prestigious gallery with his heart pounding in his chest. His artwork was tucked under his arm, carefully wrapped in protective cloth. This was his chance, the one he'd been dreaming about for years. The Gallery of Modern Masters was known for showcasing the finest artists in the world, and if Leroy could just get his work in front of the right person, everything could change. His paintings weren't just any paintings, they were a reflection of his soul, his life experiences, his struggles. To him, each stroke of color and texture told a story that only those with an open mind could truly understand. But that understanding had been hard to find. He had been turned away from countless other galleries before, dismissed because of his background, because of the way he looked. Being a black artist in the world of high-end galleries was like trying to force your way into a club that was determined to keep you out. But Leroy was determined. He had a vision, a dream of success that was just beyond his grasp. He wouldn't let anyone tell him that his dreams weren't worth pursuing. As Leroy stepped inside, the scent of rich wood, fresh paint, and expensive leather filled his nostrils. The gallery's walls were adorned with abstract, colorful canvases that seemed to pulse with life. The lighting was dramatic, casting shadows that made each piece look like it was alive, each one carefully selected to evoke awe and admiration. Leroy felt the weight of his art, its importance, bearing down on him as he walked past the paintings, glancing at each one, wondering if they would ever be seen the way his would be, if they ever had the chance. "Excuse me, sir, can I help you?" A young woman's voice interrupted his thoughts. Leroy turned around to see a sharply dressed assistant, her professional demeanor matching the luxurious atmosphere of the gallery. She was in her mid-20s, her eyes scanning him as if trying to place him. "Yes, I'd like to speak to the owner. I have some artwork that I'd like to show him," Leroy said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the nerves building up in his stomach. He adjusted the bundle of paintings under his arm, trying to look confident. "Of course. Let me check if Mr. Caldwell is available." She gave him a polite but distant smile, then walked away with a quick, efficient pace, leaving Leroy standing in the middle of the gallery, feeling both out of place and determined. He glanced around again at the pieces hanging on the walls. Some were grandiose abstracts in bold colors, others were minimalistic works that seemed too simple to deserve such a prestigious space. Leroy had always been frustrated by the art world's obsession with the unconventional and the obscure. His own work, with its rich narratives and powerful messages, was dismissed far too often as being too direct or too accessible. But Leroy knew that one day, his art would find its audience, he just needed the right person to see it. After a few minutes, the assistant returned, this time with a man following her. Leroy's heart skipped a beat. The man was tall, well-groomed, and dressed in a sharp suit that screamed wealth and sophistication. This must be Mr. Caldwell, the owner of the gallery. Leroy straightened up, his nerves intensifying as the man approached. "Hello, I'm Vincent Caldwell," the gallery owner said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, but his eyes seemed to look past Leroy, not quite making eye contact. Leroy shook his hand, trying to steady his breath. "I'm Leroy Williams," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "I'm an artist, and I brought some of my work to show you." Caldwell raised an eyebrow, looking at the bundle of paintings with slight disdain. "I see," he said, his voice condescending. "Well, I must admit, we don't usually work with new artists unless they've already made a name for themselves in the market. But I'm happy to take a look." Leroy couldn't hide the bitterness that rose in his chest. "I understand, but I believe my work speaks for itself. I'd appreciate your thoughts on it." Caldwell shrugged indifferently. "All right then, let's see what you've got." He gestured for Leroy to follow him toward a private viewing area in the back. The assistant stepped aside, her expression neutral as she disappeared into the gallery. Leroy walked with Caldwell, each step feeling heavier than the last. He could sense the gallery owner's dismissive attitude, but he pushed it aside. This was his moment to shine. Once inside the private space, Leroy unwrapped his paintings and placed them on the floor in front of Caldwell. Each piece was a testament to his journey, vivid scenes from his childhood, portraits of family, reflections on race, identity, and the complexities of the world he lived in. His brushstrokes were bold, energetic, filled with emotion. There was no subtlety in his work, everything was there for the world to see, to understand. Caldwell stared down at the paintings, his eyes scanning them without a hint of recognition or appreciation. Leroy held his breath, waiting for the critique, the judgment. "Well," Caldwell said after a long pause, "I'll be honest with you. These pieces are interesting, but they're far too basic. Too colorful. You see, modern art is all about abstraction, pushing boundaries. What you've done here is, well, it's a bit too accessible." He chuckled to himself, clearly proud of his own cleverness. Leroy's stomach twisted in knots, but he didn't let it show. He had heard this before. "I understand. But my work is meant to be relatable. It's about connecting with people, not just showing off technical skills. It's meant to tell a story." Caldwell waved his hand dismissively. Sure. But you see, art collectors these days want pieces that are more avant-garde. You need to think outside the box, not inside it. People don't want to look at a painting and immediately know what it's about. They want something mysterious, something that challenges them. Leroy held back a sarcastic laugh. Caldwell clearly had no idea what he was talking about. "I disagree," Leroy said, his voice calm but firm. "Art should be about making people feel something, not just intellectualizing it. If people can't connect with it, what's the point?" Caldwell looked at him for a moment, his expression hardening. "Look, I've been in this business for decades. I know what sells, and this," he said, motioning to the paintings, "this is not it." Leroy nodded, his face a mask of calm. "Thank you for your time." He packed up his paintings, feeling the weight of each one as if it carried the burden of every rejection he'd faced. He didn't argue or beg for a chance, he simply left, knowing that someday, someone would see the value in his work. Someday, he would prove Caldwell wrong. As Leroy walked out of the gallery, the door closing softly behind him, he couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. This wasn't over. The gallery owner might have dismissed him today, but Leroy knew that the art world had a way of turning things around. He had to keep moving forward, keep creating. The world would catch up with him eventually. And when it did, it would be too late for Caldwell. Leroy left the Gallery of Modern Masters feeling a mixture of frustration and resolve. The rejection stung, but it wasn't unfamiliar. He had grown used to it over the years. What hurt the most wasn't just the dismissal of his work, but the underlying assumption that someone like him, someone who didn't fit the typical image of an artist in the prestigious galleries of New York City, could never succeed. The prejudice, subtle and overt, had always been there, but this time, it felt like it came from a place of arrogance, from a man who was too entrenched in his own world to see beyond the surface. As Leroy made his way down the steps of the gallery, he tried to push the negative thoughts aside. The rejection was just one step in a long journey. The world of art was vast, and there were plenty of places where his talent would be recognized. He had always known it would take time, but he also knew that persistence would pay off. He just needed the right connections, the right people who would appreciate his vision. That night, after returning to his small studio apartment, Leroy sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, and began to look for new opportunities. The internet was a resource he used constantly, researching upcoming art auctions, art collectors, and galleries that might be open to new, untested talent. His mind was alive with ideas, and his fingers hovered over the keyboard as he made plans to push forward. He was determined to find a way into the art world, no matter the obstacles. But as he searched through art blogs and forums, something caught his eye. An article detailing the financial struggles of Vincent Caldwell, the gallery owner who had mocked him just hours earlier, filled the screen. It seemed Caldwell's gallery was in danger of going under. The article described how the gallery had been losing business and failing to bring in new artists that could generate the kind of profit needed to keep the business afloat. Leroy's curiosity piqued. This was the kind of information he needed. Not just to move forward with his own career, but to understand the industry he was dealing with. Leroy read through the article carefully. The gallery owner, who had once dismissed him with such arrogance, was facing a crisis. The report detailed how Caldwell's refusal to diversify his roster had alienated potential clients and left his business on the brink of bankruptcy. The man who had turned him away was now scrambling for a solution, desperate to find a new artist who could bring in a fresh wave of buyers. It was in that moment that Leroy saw an opportunity not just for himself, but for a kind of revenge. His mind raced, and he began to form a plan. The art world was a complicated web of power, influence, and money. And if Caldwell wanted to find a successful artist who could save his gallery, Leroy was just the person to show him exactly how wrong he had been. He didn't take immediate action. Leroy wasn't foolish enough to rush into things. Instead, he spent the next few weeks watching the gallery, monitoring its exhibitions, and carefully observing the art world around him. He knew he had something valuable, and the more he learned about the inner workings of high-end galleries, the more he understood the game he was now playing. Through his research, Leroy discovered that Vincent Caldwell's desperation had led him to attend several high-profile art auctions, seeking out rare pieces from rising stars. Caldwell was a man who could not afford to make another mistake. He needed artists who could generate buzz, who could create a stir in the art world, artists like Leroy. But Leroy wasn't ready to just hand over his work. He knew that in order to get Caldwell's attention, he had to make his move carefully. The artist had to have power in the transaction, not just be the one hoping to be noticed. Over the next few months, Leroy's reputation in the underground art scene began to grow. He had been selling his pieces to a select group of high-profile collectors, people who appreciated his art for what it truly was, not for the name of the gallery it came from. Leroy had always felt that his work could transcend the boundaries of race and class. The stories he told through his art spoke to the human experience, to struggles and triumphs that were universal. His work wasn't just for the wealthy elite, it was for anyone who could see the beauty in raw emotion, in depth, in truth. In this time, Leroy's artwork began to gain recognition beyond the niche circles he had originally sold to. His paintings appeared in several prominent collections, and their prices began to rise dramatically. The world of art was starting to take notice. It was during this time that Leroy met with a few influential art investors, people who recognized his potential and saw that his work was worth far more than Caldwell or anyone else had realized. They encouraged him to take the next step and show the world what he was capable of. With their backing, Leroy was now poised to make a much bigger impact. One day, as Leroy was walking through an art auction house, a familiar name caught his eye on the list of bidders, Vincent Caldwell. The gallery owner had become a regular bidder, attempting to purchase works by rising stars in hopes of turning his gallery's fortunes around. Leroy smiled to himself. This was it. Caldwell was desperate to find something, anything, that could save his sinking business. Leroy had already begun purchasing high-value pieces for himself, a carefully planned acquisition strategy that would put him in a position of power. But he wasn't done with Caldwell yet. Leroy's goal was clear, to not just surpass Caldwell as an artist, but to become a silent force in the very industry that had once rejected him. By the time Caldwell realized who was buying the pieces he was so desperately trying to acquire, it would be far too late. The first painting Leroy purchased at auction from one of Caldwell's competitors was a piece that had once been owned by one of the gallery's most prestigious clients. The piece had been valued at several $100,000, but Leroy was able to acquire it for a fraction of its true worth. As he left the auction house, the weight of the painting in his hands felt like a symbol of everything he had been working for, everything he was about to become. Caldwell's name became a regular feature in the bidding wars Leroy took part in. Each piece Leroy bought was another small victory, a step closer to the ultimate confrontation. It wasn't just about proving that he was a better artist, it was about showing Caldwell, and the entire art world, that the tables had turned. Leroy Williams was no longer the artist on the outside, struggling for recognition. He was now the one making the rules. As Leroy watched Caldwell continue to bid on works he could no longer afford, he couldn't help but feel a certain satisfaction. The man who had once mocked him, who had told him that his work wasn't good enough, was now chasing after Leroy's success. But Leroy wasn't finished yet. The real lesson was yet to come. Leroy's transformation was subtle at first, like a seed taking root beneath the surface of the earth, unseen but growing stronger with each passing day. As his work gained recognition and his stature in the art world began to rise, he became more than just an artist. He was evolving into something else, something bigger. He was no longer the struggling creator trying to make a name for himself. Leroy was now a player in a world of power, influence, and wealth. It wasn't just the art that had changed, it was Leroy himself. His interactions with others in the art world, collectors, investors, even fellow artists, became more measured, more calculated. He began to understand the delicate balance between artistry and business. Leroy had always believed that art should be about the message, about telling stories that matter. But now, he realized that to truly succeed, he had to play the game. And Leroy was a quick learner. His work continued to skyrocket in value. What had once been dismissed as too simple by gallery owners like Caldwell was now being sold at high-end auctions for millions. Collectors who had once ignored his paintings were now fighting over them. Leroy's name was becoming synonymous with innovation, authenticity, and raw emotion. His paintings spoke to the complexities of identity, race, and the human experience in ways that few other artists had dared to do. They weren't just images on canvas, they were invitations to reflect, to challenge preconceived notions, and to see the world differently. But Leroy wasn't content with just being an artist. He had bigger ambitions. His art had become a means to an end, a way to gain entry into a world that had once rejected him, and now, he was positioning himself to reshape it. The opportunity to buy his first major piece from an auction had been a turning point. Leroy had always been aware of the power of art as an investment, but he had never thought of it in such a calculated way. Now, with a significant amount of capital backing him, Leroy began acquiring works from galleries, estates, and private collections, pieces that weren't just valuable, but strategic. Every painting he acquired gave him more influence, more control over the art world's narrative. It was clear that the game was shifting. The power had been in the hands of the galleries, the curators, the buyers who set the prices and made the decisions about which artists would thrive and which would fade into obscurity. But Leroy was flipping the script. He was buying the art that would have once been out of his reach, not just for his personal collection, but to make a statement. With every piece he purchased, he was consolidating his power. As Leroy's art empire grew, so did his circle. He surrounded himself with influential art investors, people who understood the market and who saw Leroy's potential not just as an artist, but as a force to be reckoned with. Together, they formed an unspoken alliance, an understanding that Leroy was more than just an artist. He was a buyer, a mover, a shaker in the art world. But Leroy knew it wasn't enough to simply be successful in his own right. He had to have the power to shape the future of the art world. The galleries, the institutions, the buyers, they were the gatekeepers, and Leroy needed to become one of them. The first step in his transformation was a series of high-profile purchases. Leroy made waves by acquiring iconic works of art from some of the most prestigious galleries in New York, Paris, and London. These were pieces that had once been considered unattainable, even for the wealthiest of collectors. But Leroy's influence and wealth allowed him to take control of these artworks, putting him on the map as a serious player in the market. As his collection grew, so did his reputation. No longer was he the unknown artist with big dreams. Leroy Williams was becoming a name people feared and respected in equal measure. His purchases were making headlines, and art investors started to take notice. People began to realize that Leroy wasn't just buying art for the sake of it, he was building a legacy, creating a lasting presence in the art world that would transcend individual works and shift the very foundations of the industry. And then came the moment Leroy had been waiting for. The opportunity to buy into one of the most coveted galleries in the world, the Gallery of Modern Masters. The very gallery that had once rejected him, mocked him, had now become a target. Leroy had already made a series of silent moves behind the scenes, acquiring shares and assets from various art institutions. But the gallery of modern masters represented the pinnacle, the ultimate symbol of his power. Leroy reached out to several investors and art moguls, convincing them that the gallery's future was bleak without a drastic change in direction. It was no secret that Caldwell's gallery was struggling, and Leroy saw an opportunity to not just take it over, but to transform it into something new, something that would reflect the true value of artists who had been overlooked by the old guard. The plan was set into motion. Leroy, with his vast network of investors, began quietly acquiring stakes in the gallery. At first, Caldwell had no idea that the artist he had once ridiculed was now slowly taking control of his business. Leroy wasn't just buying pieces of art anymore, he was buying a piece of the very industry that had once shut him out. The next few months were a blur of negotiations, meetings, and deals. Leroy didn't just want to be a shareholder in the gallery, he wanted to own it. He knew that owning the gallery would give him the ultimate power to shape the narrative of art, to create a space where artists like him, artists who had always been marginalized, could thrive. He envisioned a gallery that was diverse, inclusive, and dedicated to showcasing talent that had been overlooked by the traditional art world. As Leroy's presence in the art world grew, so did the rumors. People began to whisper about the mysterious new buyer who had been sweeping up priceless art pieces at auction. The world was starting to take notice, and Leroy was finally stepping into the light, no longer the unknown artist fighting for a chance, but the new king of the art world, shaping it from the inside out. One day, Leroy received a call that he knew would be the turning point. It was from Vincent Caldwell himself. "Mr. Williams, I'm aware of your recent acquisitions," Caldwell said, his voice tight with barely veiled frustration. "You've been buying up everything I've worked for. You've got to understand, these pieces are part of my gallery's identity." Leroy paused before responding, his voice calm but filled with the power of someone who knew they had the upper hand. "I understand, Mr. Caldwell. But you see, your gallery's identity is about to change. And so will the art world." Leroy knew that the phone call with Vincent Caldwell would be a pivotal moment, but he wasn't prepared for the tension that filled the air when the gallery owner finally agreed to meet in person. Leroy had carefully orchestrated every step of this process, from his art acquisitions to the silent buying of shares in Caldwell's floundering gallery, but nothing could prepare him for the weight of the moment. Caldwell was clearly on edge, and Leroy could see the fear hidden beneath the bravado. The meeting was set for a quiet cafe in Midtown Manhattan, a place where the noise of the city could be muffled by the walls, where secrets could be exchanged without the threat of unwanted ears. Leroy arrived early, his calm demeanor betraying none of the excitement or tension building within him. He had waited for this moment for months, watching Caldwell's desperate attempts to hold on to his failing gallery, knowing that the man who had once rejected him would soon be powerless to stop him. When Caldwell walked in, his face was tight with the strain of someone who had been fighting a losing battle for far too long. He wore his usual expensive suit, but there was something about his posture, the way his shoulders were slightly hunched, that made him seem smaller, weaker. Leroy stood to greet him, extending his hand. Caldwell shook it, his grip stiff and unyielding. "Mr. Caldwell," Leroy said, his voice smooth and controlled, "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me." Caldwell nodded curtly, but Leroy could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Let's get straight to the point, Mr. Williams. I know what you've been doing. You've been buying up pieces from my gallery, from my competitors, and I'm not blind to the fact that you've been quietly acquiring shares in my business. So, what's this all about?" Leroy leaned back in his chair, studying the man who had once dismissed him. He could feel the weight of his own power in that moment, the sense that the tables had completely turned. "What it's about, Mr. Caldwell," Leroy began, his voice measured, "is that I'm taking over. Your gallery, your legacy, it's mine now. Or at least, it will be soon." The words hung in the air like a challenge, but Caldwell wasn't ready for the full weight of Leroy's statement. He blinked, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face before his eyes narrowed with a mixture of anger and confusion. "Taking over?" Caldwell repeated, almost laughing, as if the very idea was absurd. "You think you can just waltz in here, buy a few paintings, and suddenly you own my gallery? This is a multi-million-dollar business, Williams. You have no idea what you're up against. Leroy didn't flinch. He had seen this kind of reaction before, prideful, defiant resistance from those who had never been forced to confront their own shortcomings. I know exactly what I'm up against, Vincent. You've been playing the game for years, but the rules are changing. People like you have held the power for too long, keeping artists like me on the outside, treating us like commodities. But that's over now. I'm taking control of this industry. Caldwell's face twisted with a mixture of rage and desperation. You're nothing but an artist. You think you can change the art world? You're just one person. Leroy stood up, his voice growing more forceful, more certain with each word. That's where you're wrong. I'm not just an artist anymore. I'm a force in this industry. I've seen how the system works, how galleries like yours take advantage of people, of real talent, and I've played by your rules long enough. Now, the tables have turned. Caldwell's face reddened, but Leroy could see that there was a glimmer of fear in his eyes now. The arrogance that had once defined him was starting to crumble. Leroy had come for him, and there was no escaping the reality of what was happening. I built this gallery, Williams, Caldwell snapped. I made it what it is today. You think you can just come in and take that from me? Leroy took a step closer, his presence imposing, the power of the moment fully settling in. You built this gallery by exploiting talent like mine, by undervaluing artists who had something real to say. You thought you could control who rises and who falls. But what you didn't count on was someone like me, someone who sees through your system and has the resources to change it. I'm not here to take from you. I'm here to take what's mine. For a moment, there was a tense silence. Leroy could feel the weight of his words sink in, and he watched as Caldwell wrestled with the reality of his situation. Leroy knew it wasn't just about the gallery, it was about everything Caldwell represented, the old guard of the art world, the system of gatekeepers and wealthy collectors who had marginalized artists like Leroy for so long. Finally, Caldwell spoke, his voice low and almost defeated. So, what do you want from me? Leroy smiled, but there was no warmth in it. What I want is simple. I want to reshape this gallery. I want to open doors for the artists you've turned away, the ones you thought weren't good enough for your space. I want a gallery that represents the future of art, not just the past. And I want you to step aside. Caldwell's eyes widened in disbelief. You're insane. You can't just take my business from me. I'm not taking anything, Leroy replied, his voice calm but firm. I'm buying it. I'm offering you an opportunity to walk away, to let go of your pride and your fear. You can leave with whatever dignity you have left, or you can fight me and watch everything you built crumble. The tension in the room was palpable. Caldwell looked like a man who had just been knocked off his pedestal, and Leroy could see the wheels turning in his mind, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. But it was too late. Leroy had already won. He had control now, and there was nothing Caldwell could do to stop him. You'll regret this, Caldwell muttered under his breath. Maybe, Leroy said, turning to leave. But not as much as you will. As Leroy walked out of the cafe, a wave of triumph washed over him. The conversation with Caldwell had been tense, but it had also been a moment of clarity. Leroy had come full circle, from the artist rejected by galleries to the man who now controlled one of the most influential art institutions in the world. He had achieved his goal. But Leroy wasn't finished yet. This was just the beginning. Now, it was time to rebuild, to transform the art world into something that truly represented the diverse voices and talents that had always been overlooked. The world was ready for a change, and Leroy Williams was going to make sure it happened. After the confrontation with Caldwell, Leroy felt a sense of finality, but the work was far from over. He had taken the first step in changing the art world, but now it was time to follow through. Leroy had the gallery. He had the power. But more importantly, he had a vision. The morning after the meeting, Leroy sat in his new office at the Gallery of Modern Masters, the very space where Caldwell had once been king. The gallery was large, but the walls felt cold and empty. Leroy walked through the vast halls, running his fingers along the walls where the most coveted pieces of art had once hung, the pieces that were now his. He could hear the echoes of the gallery's former glory, whispers of artists who had been pushed aside, ignored, or undervalued. It was clear that Caldwell had built his empire on the backs of talented creators, using them as stepping stones to climb higher, but never truly acknowledging their worth. Leroy's thoughts were consumed with how much had been overlooked, how much potential had been wasted. Leroy had always known that the art world was as much about business as it was about creativity. But now that he was in control, he saw just how much power could be wielded through art, through ownership, through influence. And Leroy was going to use that power to give a platform to the artists who had been denied that chance. His vision was clear. He wasn't going to run another art gallery where only the rich and elite had access to the works of established artists. Leroy was going to build something different, something that reflected the diverse voices and talents that were waiting to be recognized. The gallery would become a sanctuary for the underrepresented, a place where artists from all backgrounds could have their work displayed, celebrated, and sold for the value it deserved. Leroy's first order of business was to overhaul the gallery's entire structure. The days of exclusivity were over. He wasn't interested in feeding into the elite circle that Caldwell had cultivated. Leroy was going to create a space where every artist had an equal chance to succeed. To do this, he began by reaching out to artists he had known throughout his career, those who had struggled to get their work seen by the right people. It wasn't just about diversity in the artists he showcased, it was about authenticity. Leroy wanted work that spoke to the real experiences of people. He wanted art that challenged the status quo, that made people think and feel in ways that pushed boundaries. He didn't want to showcase paintings that were only valuable because they fit into the established narrative of what high art was supposed to be. He wanted art that broke free from convention, art that could transform the way people saw the world. Leroy's plan was ambitious. But as he sat in his office, poring over lists of artists, gallery designs, and budgets, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his own ambitions. It was one thing to have control of the gallery, but it was another thing entirely to reshape it into something that had never existed before. He began with a roster of diverse, bold, and innovative artists. He wanted to fill the gallery with work that told stories about the African diaspora, about migration, about systemic oppression, about personal identity, stories that had been relegated to the margins by the old guard. Leroy wasn't interested in the glossy, sanitized works that played to wealthy tastes. He wanted pieces that were raw, that spoke truthfully about the human experience, regardless of how uncomfortable it might make the upper crust feel. With the help of a few trusted allies in the art world, collectors, critics, and even other gallery owners who had always believed in Leroy's vision, he began building the foundation for his new gallery. He knew it would take time to dismantle the structures that had been built over decades, but he was ready. And, as the pieces began to fall into place, Leroy's excitement grew. He'd already begun to reach out to potential buyers and investors who understood the future of the art world. These weren't just people who cared about the financial return of art. Leroy wanted buyers who appreciated the value of the stories told through each piece, the value of art that challenged and pushed boundaries. The media began to take notice of Leroy's rise. Headlines about the mysterious artist-turned-gallery owner spread across art magazines and news outlets. Interviews, podcasts, and social media posts began to build the narrative of Leroy's transformation, and the more the world learned about him, the more they began to understand his true intentions. One evening, Leroy stood in front of the large windows in his office, looking out at the city below. The gallery was a reflection of him, of his struggles, his triumphs, and his vision for the future. It was a place of change, a place where art would be a tool for empowerment, not exploitation. As Leroy looked down at the city lights, he reflected on how far he had come. From being a young artist ignored by the galleries to now owning the very institution that had once rejected him, Leroy had made it. But the journey wasn't over. The world was watching, waiting to see what he would do next. The first exhibition in the new gallery was set to open in just a few weeks, and Leroy couldn't wait to reveal it to the world. It would be a statement, his statement. A statement that the art world was no longer controlled by the old powers, that art wasn't just for the elite. It was for everyone. The opening night would feature a carefully curated collection, showcasing a variety of artists from diverse backgrounds. Leroy would be there, of course, but this night wasn't about him. It was about the artists whose work had been hidden for far too long. It was about telling their stories, their truths, through their art. And Leroy was going to be the one to make sure the world heard them. The opening night of Leroy's new gallery was a culmination of everything he had worked for, and yet, it felt like the start of something even bigger. The gallery was packed with art collectors, critics, curators, and industry professionals, all eager to see what Leroy had created. He stood at the center of it all, but he wasn't interested in the spotlight. This night wasn't about him, it was about the artists whose work he had spent months cultivating, and the stories they were ready to tell the world. As the guests flowed in, the excitement was palpable. The walls of the gallery were filled with powerful, thought-provoking pieces that challenged the very fabric of the art world. There were works that spoke to the Black experience, that illuminated the intersections of race, identity, and history. Pieces that addressed systemic oppression, migration, and the complexities of belonging. Each work had a story to tell, and Leroy had made sure that every artist in his gallery had the space to tell it. Leroy stood near the entrance, greeting people as they walked in, his demeanor calm but assertive. His presence alone commanded attention, but it was the art on the walls that truly spoke. The works were vibrant, bold, and unapologetic. They challenged the norms of what was considered high art and defied expectations. Leroy smiled as he watched the guests' reactions. Some were taken aback by the rawness of the pieces, others were immediately drawn to the emotional power that each work radiated. One of the first pieces that drew a crowd was a large painting by a Black artist named Amina Jefferson, whose work had previously been relegated to smaller, less prestigious galleries. The piece, titled Roots of Our Struggle, was a powerful abstract representation of the African diaspora, using vibrant colors and bold strokes to depict the journey of a people torn from their homeland and scattered across the globe. The piece was chaotic yet beautiful, and it left viewers both mesmerized and moved. Another work that captivated the audience was a sculpture by a Middle Eastern artist, Omar Khoury, whose piece, The Chains We Wear, depicted a series of interwoven metal chains suspended in midair. The piece symbolized the invisible systems of control and oppression that bound marginalized communities, and the intricate design challenged the viewer to question the ways in which they were complicit in those systems. Leroy moved through the crowd, watching how the guests interacted with the art. The conversations that took place were not the typical shallow musings about technique or surface-level aesthetics. Instead, people were discussing the emotions the pieces evoked, the stories behind the artists, and the narratives that had often been excluded from mainstream art circles. It was everything Leroy had hoped for. At the far end of the gallery, Leroy spotted a familiar face, Vincent Caldwell. The gallery owner had been lurking in the background since he arrived, his presence almost ghostly, as if he couldn't quite accept the reality of what was happening. Leroy had been expecting him. Caldwell had been one of the first to receive an invitation, though Leroy wasn't sure if it was out of curiosity, resentment, or a need to see for himself what Leroy had accomplished. Either way, Leroy was determined not to let the old guard steal the spotlight tonight. He approached Caldwell, who was standing near one of the more abstract pieces, his arms crossed in front of him, his expression unreadable. Leroy could sense the tension in the air as they locked eyes. "Well, Mr. Caldwell," Leroy said, his voice steady, "I'm glad you could make it. What do you think?" Caldwell didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a long look around the gallery, his gaze sweeping over the works with a mix of disbelief and disdain. It was clear that he didn't understand the power or significance of the pieces. He had always prided himself on recognizing art that fit into the traditional, market-driven mold, and Leroy's new vision threatened everything he had built. "I have to admit, I didn't expect this," Caldwell said finally, his voice low and tight with frustration. "You've certainly made an impression, but I'm not sure if the market is ready for this." Leroy raised an eyebrow, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his lips. The market is always ready for what people are willing to invest in. The question is, are you willing to challenge the status quo, or are you too afraid to let go of your old way of thinking? Caldwell scowled, his face reddening slightly, but he remained silent. Leroy could tell he was seething with frustration. The gallery he had once run with such arrogance had already started to lose its relevance in the face of Leroy's rise. As the evening continued, Leroy watched as more guests arrived, some of them curiously studying the works, others making arrangements to purchase pieces. The buzz in the air was electric. The critics who had once dismissed Leroy as just another artist were now scrambling to get in on the action, eager to write about the innovative new direction he was pushing. Even some of the wealthier buyers, those who had once only shown interest in the established artists, were beginning to recognize the value of what Leroy was offering. But it wasn't just the critics and the buyers who were taking notice. It was the artists themselves, the ones who had been overlooked by the industry for so long, who were beginning to feel like they finally had a place in the art world. Leroy's gallery wasn't just a commercial venture, it was a movement. And it was only just beginning. The night ended with a private gathering in the back room, where Leroy had invited a select group of artists, buyers, and influencers to celebrate. The conversation was lively and full of energy as people discussed the works, the impact they hoped to make, and the future of art in an increasingly diverse world. Leroy listened intently, smiling to himself as he realized just how far he had come. Vincent Caldwell slipped out of the room before the evening ended, his departure unnoticed by most of the crowd. Leroy didn't need to watch him leave. He knew that Caldwell's time had passed. The future was in the hands of artists like him, artists who saw the world differently, who valued authenticity over conformity, and who were determined to reshape the narrative of the art world. As the night wound down and the last of the guests trickled out, Leroy took a moment to step outside and breathe in the cool night air. The gallery had been a success, and more importantly, it had marked the beginning of a new era for art. Leroy's vision was now a reality, and there was no turning back. The art world had already started to change, and Leroy Williams was at the center of it. The gallery's success wasn't just measured by the number of paintings sold or the celebrities who attended its opening night. It was about something deeper, something far more profound. Leroy Williams had proven that art was more than just a commodity, it was a platform for change, a space for empowerment, and a reflection of the world as it truly was. The months following the grand opening were a whirlwind. The art world had never seen anything quite like Leroy's gallery. The media buzzed with excitement, and the growing movement around the gallery attracted international attention. Critics who had once dismissed Leroy as an artist who would never make it were now writing feature articles about his vision, his values, and the artists he had championed. The cultural landscape was shifting, and Leroy was at the forefront of it all. As Leroy's reputation grew, so did the gallery's influence. The sales were unprecedented, not just because of the financial value of the art, but because of the stories the art told. Artists who had once struggled to find recognition were now in high demand. They were being featured in major exhibitions, their works being sold at auctions for record-breaking prices. Leroy had created a space where art wasn't just bought and sold, it was a conversation starter, a vehicle for social change, and a symbol of resistance against the old guard of the art world. For Leroy, this was just the beginning. He didn't just want to create a successful gallery, he wanted to change the way the entire industry operated. He began collaborating with other galleries around the world, sharing his vision and helping them implement similar practices. His focus on diversity, authenticity, and storytelling became the new standard for what art should be. And the more Leroy expanded his network, the more he realized just how deep the art world's need for change went. One day, Leroy received a phone call that confirmed what he had suspected all along. Caldwell's gallery, once the crown jewel of the art world, was struggling. The investors who had once backed Caldwell were growing impatient, and the buyers who had supported him were now turning to Leroy's gallery. The shift in the art world was irreversible. Leroy's approach had redefined what success in the art world looked like, and it was clear that Caldwell's outdated model no longer had a place. As Leroy sat in his office, reflecting on the journey he had taken, he couldn't help but smile. He had done it. He had not only taken control of his own destiny, but had also dismantled an old, stagnant system. He had turned the very gallery that had once mocked him into a powerful tool for social change. The art world that had ignored his talent and discarded his work was now a world he controlled. Leroy Williams was no longer just an artist, he was a force to be reckoned with. A meeting was scheduled with Caldwell. Leroy had considered many ways to handle this moment. He could have confronted Caldwell, demanding a public apology. He could have taken over Caldwell's business in one swift move. But Leroy wasn't interested in revenge or humiliation. Instead, he saw the meeting as an opportunity for growth, for Caldwell and for the future of the art world. When Caldwell walked into the meeting room, Leroy could see that he was a shell of the man he had once been. The arrogance had faded, replaced with a sense of defeat. It was clear that Caldwell had come to terms with the fact that the art world had passed him by. Leroy greeted him with a firm handshake and a nod, not out of animosity, but out of respect for what Caldwell had once built. "I know this isn't easy for you, Vincent," Leroy said, leaning back in his chair. "But the world has changed. The gallery you built is no longer the center of the art world. It's time for a new approach, one that's more inclusive and more true to what art really represents." Caldwell remained silent, but Leroy could see the regret in his eyes. The old guard was crumbling, and Caldwell was a relic of a time that had passed. Leroy didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The facts were undeniable. Leroy had won. His vision for a more inclusive, diverse art world had triumphed. "I understand," Caldwell finally said, his voice quiet. "I've seen the success you've had. I can't deny it. But you're right. I didn't see it coming." Leroy leaned forward, his tone softer. "It's not too late to change, Vincent. There's always room for new ideas. If you want, I can help you transition your gallery. You don't have to compete with what I'm doing. There's space for everyone in this world. But it has to be about the art and the people behind it, not just the business." Caldwell looked at Leroy, and for the first time in years, he seemed to see the bigger picture. It was clear that the world Leroy had created was one Caldwell could never have envisioned, one based on empathy, inclusion, and real value. "Thank you," Caldwell said quietly, his voice tinged with something that might have been gratitude. "I think I've spent too long trying to hold on to the past. Maybe it's time to let go." Leroy stood up, offering his hand to Caldwell one last time. "It's never too late to change, Vincent. The world will keep moving forward, with or without us. The question is, do we want to be part of it?" Caldwell nodded, and with that, the meeting ended. Leroy knew that this was the final step in his journey. He had not only achieved his dream but had also paved the way for others to follow. His gallery was no longer just a business, it was a movement, a symbol of what could happen when artists were given the space and support to truly thrive. As Leroy watched the sunset from his office window, he realized that his journey wasn't just about proving Caldwell wrong. It was about redefining the future of art, making it a space where every artist, regardless of race or background, could find a place to shine. He had created a new world, one where art was about more than just money or prestige. It was about telling the stories that had long been silenced, and in doing so, creating a more inclusive and powerful art world for the future.